Our lesson for today is all about illustrating SSS, SAS, and ASA congruence postulates. So, if you are interested for this lesson, watch this video. Again, our lesson for today is all about illustrating SSS, SAS, and ASA congruence postulate. From the previous lesson, you already learned about triangle congruence. The two triangles become congruent using corresponding congruent parts on angles and sides. Do we always have to prove that the 6 corresponding parts of two triangles are congruent before we could make a conclusion that the triangles are congruent? In this lesson, we can use congruence postulates to illustrate that the two triangles are congruent. For our first activity, we have give me my pair. You are going to identify the pairs of congruent sides and congruent angles of the triangles on the slide. You can write your answer on a separate sheet of paper. I will give you 1 minute to answer the activity. Time's up. Now, let's check your answer. For our congruent sides, line segment TE is congruent to line segment AG or line segment GA. Next, line segment LT is congruent to line segment MA or line segment AM. Next, for last congruent side, for our line segment LE is congruent to line segment MG or line segment GM. Let's proceed now to the congruent angles. For angle G, it is congruent to angle E. For angle M, it is congruent to angle L. And for angle A, it is congruent to angle T. Congruent triangles are used to make the roofs of the buildings and houses stable. We can also see congruent triangles in the rails of the bridges to reinforce its structure so that it will become strong and firm. But how can we say that the two triangles are congruent? We can use postulates on triangle congruence in order to show that the two triangles are congruent. These congruence postulates give ways on what pair of corresponding parts illustrates triangle congruence. For our first congruence postulate, we have what we call the SSS, or the side, side, and side. Based on the definition, if the 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to the 3 sides of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. We can illustrate the congruency of the two triangles using SSS congruence postulate by considering triangle BIG and triangle TOY on the slide. Our first congruent side, if line segment BI is congruent to line segment TO. Next, line segment IG is congruent to line segment OY, our second pair of congruent side. And line segment BG is congruent to line segment TY, our last pair of congruent side. Then, triangle BIG is congruent to triangle TOY by SSS congruence postulate. In the figure in the slide, corresponding congruent parts are marked to show that the two triangles are congruent by SSS congruence postulate. For our first figure, let's identify the congruent parts. Line segment AO is congruent to line segment CO. Line segment BO is congruent to line segment DO. And line segment AB is congruent to line segment DC. Then, triangle AOB is congruent to triangle COD. For the second figure, let's identify the congruent parts. Line segment AM is congruent to line segment BN. Next, line segment BM is congruent to line segment AN. And for the last pair of congruent side, line segment AB is congruent to line segment AB. Then, triangle ABM is congruent to triangle BAN. For our third figure, the congruent parts are line segment LE is congruent to line segment LO. Next, line segment VE is congruent to line segment VO. And for our last pair, line segment LV is congruent to line segment LV by means of reflexive property. Then, triangle LEV is congruent to triangle LOV. That is the SSS congruence postulate. Next, for our second congruence postulate, we have what we call the SAS, or the side angle side congruence postulate. Based on the definition, if the two sides and an included angle of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two sides and the included angle of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Let's consider triangle JOY on the slide. The included angle is the angle between two sides of a triangle. Angle J is the included angle between line segment JO and line segment JY. Angle O is the included angle between line segment OJ and line segment OY. And angle Y is the included angle between line segment YJ and line segment YO. In triangle RIC and triangle SON, we can pair the corresponding two sides and the included angle to illustrate that the two triangles are congruent by SAS congruence postulate using an if-then statement. If line segment RI is congruent to line segment SO, which is our first pair of congruent sides. Next, angle R is congruent to angle S, which is our pair of included angle. And line segment RC is congruent to line segment SN, which is our second pair of congruent side. Then, triangle RIC is congruent to triangle SON by SAS congruence postulate. Similarly, we can give the names of the two congruent triangles using SAS congruence postulate when it was marked with corresponding congruent parts. For our first figure, let's identify the congruent parts. We have line segment BE is congruent to line segment TE. Next, for our pair of included angle, angle BES is congruent to angle TES. And for our second pair of congruent side, we have line segment SE is congruent to line segment SE by means of reflexive property. Then, triangle BES is congruent to triangle TES. For our second figure, let's identify the congruent parts. Line segment MO is congruent to line segment GO. For our pair of included angle, angle MOA is congruent to angle GON. And for our second pair of congruent side, line segment AO is congruent to line segment NO. Then, triangle MOA is congruent to triangle GON. And for our third figure, the congruent parts are our first pair of congruent side is line segment OY is congruent to line segment RU. For our pair of included angle, we can name angle by its vertex. We have angle O is congruent to angle R. And for our second pair of congruent side, we have line segment OU is congruent to line segment RY. Then, triangle YOU is congruent to triangle URY. That is the SAS congruence postulate. Next, we have what we call the ASA, or also known as the angle side angle congruence postulate. Based on the definition, if the two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and an included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Let's refer to triangle JOY again. The included side is the common side to two angles of a triangle. For our line segment JO, it is the included side between angle J and angle O. For line segment OY, it is the included side between angle O and angle Y. And for line segment JY, it is the included side between angle J and angle Y. Using triangle BET and triangle KIM, we can illustrate that these two triangles are congruent by ASA congruence postulate. If angle E is congruent to angle I, which is our first pair of congruent angle, next, line segment BE is congruent to line segment KI, which is our pair of included side, and angle B is congruent to angle K, which is our second pair of congruent angle, then triangle BET is congruent to triangle KIM by ASA congruence postulate. Congruent triangles using ASA congruence postulate with corresponding congruent parts. For the first figure, let's identify the congruent parts. Angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD, which is our first pair of congruent angle. Next, line segment AB is congruent to line segment CB, which is our pair of included side. And angle BAD is congruent to angle BCD, which is our second pair of congruent angle. Then, triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD. For our second figure, let's identify the congruent parts. Angle FHG is congruent to angle JHI, which is our first pair of congruent angle. For our pair of included side, we have line segment FH is congruent to line segment JH. And for our second pair of congruent angle, we have angle GFH is congruent to angle IJH. Then, triangle FHG is congruent to triangle JHI. For our third figure, let's identify the congruent parts. We have angle S is congruent to angle Z, which is our first pair of congruent angle. Line segment ST is congruent to line segment ZN, which is our pair of included side. And we have angle T is congruent to angle N, which is our second pair of congruent angle. Then, triangle STR is congruent to triangle ZND. Illustrating triangle congruence is not limited to the three postulates, which is SSS, SAS, and ASA. In special cases, a theorem has been proven for congruent triangles. This is the AAS, or the angle-side congruence theorem. AAS, or angle-side congruence postulate. Based on the definition, if two angles and a non-included side of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and a non-included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. We can see the triangle TRY on the slide. Non-included side can be either of the two sides that are not directly between the two angles being used. Line segment RY and line segment RT are the non-included sides between angle T and angle Y. Triangle HIP is congruent to triangle TON by AAS congruence theorem as illustrated on the slide. If line segment HP is congruent to line segment TN, which is our pair of non-included side, and angle I is congruent to angle O, which is our first pair of congruent angle, and angle P is congruent to angle N, which is our second pair of congruent angle. Then, triangle HIP is congruent to triangle TON by AAS congruence theorem. Congruent triangles by AAS congruence theorem with corresponding congruent parts are given on the slide. For our first figure, let's identify the congruent parts. We have angle REN is congruent to angle RVN, our first pair of congruent angle. We have angle ERN is congruent to angle VRN, which is our second pair of congruent angle. And line segment RN is congruent to line segment RN by means of reflexive property. And that is our pair of non-included side. Then, the triangle REN is congruent to triangle RVN. For our second figures, let's identify the congruent parts. Angle C is congruent to angle I, which is our first pair of congruent angle. We have angle A is congruent to angle O, which is our second pair of congruent angle. And we have line segment SA is congruent to line segment LO, which is our pair of non-included side. Then, triangle SAC is congruent to triangle LOI. For our third figures, let's identify the congruent parts. For our first pair of congruent angle, we have angle F is congruent to angle D. For our second pair of congruent angle, we have angle A is congruent to angle E. And for our pair of non-included side, we have line segment FD is congruent to line segment FD by means of reflexive property. Then, triangle FAD is congruent to triangle DEF. That is the AAS congruence postulate. So now, you know how to illustrate SSS, SAS, and ASA congruence postulates. You can now answer your activities on your module.